Let's talk about the audience, the people who should be watching or attending this webinar are new customers who are either new to the change management process or the ServiceNow application, people who are change management process owners or system administrators in ServiceNow, and other change owners, coordinators, and fulfillers. And this is also helpful for our partners. With that, the agenda today will be, Jason will be covering all the change management basics just to warm up a little bit, and then how ServiceNow's change management application is aligned to those processes and the ITIL processes. Then we'll go into the demonstration of a quick normal change flow, and we'll talk about quick steps on how you can quickly recognize the value of this application. We'll give some time for Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions. And in that meanwhile, I'll walk you through some additional resources that can be helpful. Now, it is all up to you, Jason.
Thank you, Rohan, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I thought that I would start off by starting with the basics and a conversation about why change management is important. What does it mean? What does it mean for our organization? And then tie that back into how ServiceNow's change management application helps to facilitate the underlying goals of the change management process. So what is the purpose of change management? ITIL describes it as the process responsible for controlling the life cycle of all changes, enabling beneficial changes to be made with a minimum disruption to IT services. And I've bolded a real key portion of that definition, and that it's really that change management is that process that ensures that we resolve incidents or issues that are in our environment. Change management's the process that enables the root cause of problems to ultimately be resolved. And it's also the process that controls the introduction of enhancements or entirely new services that we deliver to our users. A change is defined as the addition, modification, or removal of anything that could have an effect on IT services. And most of us probably associate change management and a change with something physical, a server, a database, an application server. But the scope of change management really goes beyond that to include other types of assets such as contracts or agreements. It's not just for the physical, but the virtual as well. So change management scope is broad and oftentimes much broader than what we normally would associate it with. So what are some of the objectives that ITIL describes of change management? Certainly one of them is to maximize value, reduce incidents, disruption, and rework. And we saw that in the purpose definition, but we also probably understand that change can be, when done poorly, the source of a lot of issues within our environment. There's controversial statistics that ITIL people will bat around about the percentage of incidents that are actually caused by change. And over the years, I've heard that number as high as 70%. I'm not sure I buy 70%, but I think that we can safely say that the percentage of incidents that are caused by changes is significant, and the cost of doing change poorly can be quite significant. Another objective of change is to respond to the business and the requests for change that align with business needs. We're often not simply responding to an issue in the environment, a problem that has continually recurred. Oftentimes it is because the business is demanding a particular service or an enhancement to an existing service, and change management is integrally involved in addressing those business needs. Some of our environments are going to be under legal constraints or auditing constraints, and change management's the process that ensures that all of these changes are recorded, that they're evaluated, that once approved or authorized, that they are planned, tested, delivered, documented via knowledge management, and all done in a control fashion, in a fashion that would enable environments that are subject to audit to be able to relay the paper trail that went into a particular change or series of change. I've highlighted this next objective in red because it's absolutely critical, and it's something that enables efficiencies in all of the service management processes, certainly the ones within the service operations space, and that's that any change that we make is recorded, and that the configuration items that are subject to those changes are updated. And ultimately, change is there to optimize the risk that the business may take or choose not to take in some cases. So circling back to why this is important, the cost of doing change poorly can be significant. And somewhat recently, British Airways had an event which caused a significant outage for them and stranded a number of people in the location they were in. And while the cost of that particular event at that time was significant, the cost over the longer term is probably going to be an order of magnitude greater than the cost for that day and a half that they were struggling to restore service. And it's that cost of perception, the cost of customer satisfaction. And I'm reasonably comfortable in stating that there were people traveling and stranded with BA at that point in time who are probably saying they'll never travel with British Airways again. So I just relay that story to emphasize the importance of change management, the importance of doing change management well. While we may not have tens of thousands of external consumers that are dependent on our service, in many cases we will have a significant number of users who are dependent on those services, and the cost in terms of customer satisfaction of doing change poorly can be considerable. So pivoting to ServiceNow's change management application, we've put a great deal of effort to deliver an application which aligns with the purpose that ITIL describes, the objectives or goals that ITIL describes for the process, and quite simply, our change management application is an application that provides a systematic approach to control the life cycle of all changes, enabling that beneficial change that ITIL describes to be made with a minimum disruption to IT services. ServiceNow's change management application includes 3 types, which we'll talk about in a slide or 2, but those 3 types, not surprisingly, align perfectly with the 3 types of service change that ITIL describes. Each of the change types that we offer includes a unique state and state transition model. Those state models are prescriptive in nature. So unlike an application like incident management, where you have the flexibility to move from any one state to another, change management enforces process and requires that you adhere to that process and step through that particular process based on change type in a systematic way. And those state models and the workflows behind them are based on sound practices that we've learned by working with customers like you, literally thousands of customers like you, and incorporating those lessons learned along the way. So I mentioned ITIL describes 3 types of change, and these types and definitions come straight from the ITIL service transition volume, the 2011 version of that volume. But our definition of these change types here at ServiceNow is identical. A standard change is a change that's relatively common, that's low risk. It's pre-authorized and follows a specific procedure or documented work instructions. An emergency change is a change that, as the name implies, must be performed as soon as possible, and oftentimes is in response to a major incident or some sort of security failure. And then my favorite of these definitions is the final one, which is the definition of a normal change. And a normal change, as ITIL defines it, is anything that isn't a standard or emergency change. So ITIL's definitions of these change types is I think, explicitly clear. And as you think of the sort of changes that occur in your environment, I hope it's reasonably easy to identify what changes fall within each of these 3 types of changes that ITIL describes and ServiceNow adheres to. If we looked at the life cycle of a change, and some of us could probably come up with different labels for these various steps, but starting at the inception, we identify some particular need to deliver service that's beneficial to the organization, whether that's triggered from an incident record, a problem record, service portfolio management or project management in the form of a new service offering. Ultimately, we need to document that change that's going to occur within the environment, and we do so by creating a request for change. That change, once populated, would be reviewed at multiple levels, but oftentimes the first level of approval is going to be a peer level review or a technical approval from the team that is going to be responsible for fulfilling that change. Once they have made an assessment of that particular change and determined that this change is ready for authorization, that may go to 1 or more additional teams to review and ultimately authorize the scheduling and implementation of that particular change. And once a change has been implemented, especially in cases where there may have been issues, perhaps the change was unsuccessful, perhaps the change was in response to some form of emergency, we may perform a review of that change, or something that ITIL would describe as a post-implementation review that gives the organization an opportunity to learn from what occurred, identify behaviors that they may want to change, that they may want to stop, that they may want to start doing to again, maximize the risk profile of the overall organization. And ultimately, those change requests, once implemented and verified, are closed out. So if we align what ServiceNow does from a state model perspective to the simple view of a life cycle, we have a number of different states that align perfectly with this life cycle of a change. And not every change type goes through all of these various steps, and we'll point out some of those distinctions in a few minutes. But if we pick on that normal change type, this is the state model that we offer out of the box to manage the introduction of normal changes, and it aligns really well with this simple life cycle of change that we've discussed. So ServiceNow offers a number of different ways to create a new change request. The most obvious is straight from the change management application. In the upper right of this slide, we see what's called an interceptor. And that interceptor is something that when you choose to create a new change from the change management application, comes up and you're able to select a specific type. In the case of standard changes, you also have the option of initiating those from our service catalog. Critical changes, an emergency change, often initiated from another task like an incident or problem record. And this image on the lower right demonstrates that underneath the context menu within both incident and problem, you have the ability to easily create a change of either type normal or emergency from those record types. And then based on the power of the ServiceNow platform, those tasks are inherently linked from that point forward. Perhaps less used is the ability to initiate a change straight from the CMDB. There is a related list that's available on configuration item records called change, which enables you to create a new change and have that change instantly associated with that CI by creating it from that CI record. A change does not need to be created through the CMDB to have that inherent leakage. Any change that is created and has a CI associated with it, either from the configuration item field or the affected CIs field, will create that same relationship with the configuration item within the CMDB. So you can always go back at a later date and look at a configuration item and have easy access to all the changes which have affected that configuration item over time. Once you choose to create a change request, and in this case, we're looking at the change form for a change of type normal, the form is extremely comprehensive, enables you to document anything and everything that you would possibly need to cover from a change perspective. On this planning tab, we have fields that enable you to define the justification, the implementation plan, a backout plan, a test plan, and you also have the ability to create specific change tasks for each of those possible states or parts of a change request. Under the scheduling tab, all of our related data information. What is the period of time that this change is scheduled to start? When is it scheduled to end? When did the change actually start? When did it actually end? Did it fall within that requested and ultimately authorized change window? And then as part of the assessment of risk, we will highlight a number of different relevant pieces of information that enable you to assess the risk of a potential change, including conflicts. So conflict detection is a feature of the change management application that does exactly what the name implies. It exists to detect potential conflicts in scheduling. And it uses a couple of pieces of information to determine that. First and foremost, it's the configuration item or items that are in scope for that particular change, and the planned start and planned end date of that change. Based on those three pieces of information, and this behavior is controlled by properties, so you have the ability to configure or control how conflict detection works. But based on that configuration, the following types of conflicts are cited and raised by conflict detection and exposed right within the change request form itself. And that is changes that are already scheduled against that particular CI at or around that point in time. Changes that are scheduled against a parent or child CI of the CI that's in scope for that particular change. It will cite conflicts if the change is being scheduled during a period of time that is not in a defined maintenance window. And those maintenance windows are defined using schedules from the change management application. And the final type of conflict that will be raised is if the change is being scheduled within a blackout window. And again, blackout windows are very similar to maintenance windows in the sense that it's a schedule that's defined right within the change management application. Conflict detection can run automatically as the changes are made to these three key fields that I identified. It can also be initiated manually or on a scheduled basis. In addition to conflict detection, we offer a couple of different capabilities that enable you to calculate risk. One is called risk calculation. The other is called risk assessment. In the case of risk calculation, it uses predefined risk conditions to determine the overall risk of the change. Are we being given enough lead time to assess this change and plan for it appropriately? Does this change impact a critical service? Is the complexity of the change, where complexity is a factor of the work involved, the number of teams involved, the ease or difficulty in which this change may be verified or backed out if issues arise. And these risk calculation can be run as either a manually initiated action or as a business rule in an automated fashion. Risk assessment is triggered based on conditions that are defined, and it's essentially a questionnaire that is filled in by someone associated with the change, and based on the responses to that questionnaire and the weighting that's been applied to those questions, risk and impact values can be set. So digging into risk calculation a little deeper, I mentioned these risk conditions. Risk conditions can be defined using a condition builder. In this case, they can be defined using advanced script. And once defined and we've provided the base information required to assess risk, we can initiate or calculate that risk manually. And when that risk is calculated, we'll inform you that a risk condition's been applied. In this case, I haven't provided an appropriate amount of lead time, and so we've updated the risk values as a result of that failure to plan more thoroughly. Risk assessment is a capability that can be used as a standalone capability, or it can be used to complement risk calculation. And again, it is based on a questionnaire that's defined. We obviously offer questionnaires out of the box, but you as a customer have the ability to define your own questionnaire. And if we're going to just inject a little good practice at this point in time, my advice would be to not overcomplicate your assessments. I've seen customers who had risk assessments that were more than 40 questions long. I've seen customers that had questionnaires as short as 5 questions long, and I'm not necessarily convinced the additional 35 questions got them to any different results. So if risk assessment's a capability that you'll be using, my advice is don't overcomplicate them. As we submit a change and assess the impact or risk of that particular change, ultimately that change needs to be authorized. And change management, similar to some of the other service management suite applications, uses our platform's inherent approval capability. That approval engine that the platform provides us is extremely flexible and allows you to define an approval scheme that will really meet any environment. Standard changes go through an approval process that also uses that underlying platform approval engine capability. In the case of a standard change, it starts in the form of a change proposal. That change proposal is submitted for review. That approval can be rejected and sent back to the submitter, or it can be approved. And in a case where it is approved, a standard change template is automatically created and placed into your service catalog. And once it's in the catalog, you have the ability to control access to those standard change templates using the catalog's inherent user criteria capability. So if you have specific standard changes that should only be requested by members of a particular network team, you've got complete granularity to control access to those standard changes. Normal changes go through 2 levels of approval. Assess and authorization. Assess is that technical or peer level review that I spoke of previously. Authorization is ultimately the approval to do that work as scheduled. Emergency changes, perhaps as a result of the expedited nature of them, skip that initial assessment approval level and go straight to the authorization level. And then high-risk changes can be scheduled for a CAB. Most of you probably have some form of CAB or a number of different CABs. And in the Istanbul release, we introduced a dedicated feature called the CAB Workbench that enables you to schedule, plan, and manage CAB meetings all within the ServiceNow platform. The CAB Workbench delivers a number of different efficiencies, including the automatic building of agendas and attendee lists, and then distributes invitations to the appropriate attendees when the CAB manager feels they're ready. Meetings are conducted in dedicated service portals, and you can see an example of one of those portals to the right. These portals have a few tools that are unique to them, including this contextual change calendar that you can see to the right. And that contextual change calendar shows all of those same conflict types that we just talked about when we were talking about conflict detection. Really quickly, some of the benefits: it does automate manual tasks, increase productivity, and again, it brings the entire experience onto the ServiceNow platform, so it's all on that single system of record. In the additional resources, I believe Rohan will be highlighting some prior materials that I have published in regards to the CAB Workbench, and we just did a webinar on it about 2 months ago. So if you're interested in the CAB Workbench, I will encourage you to go read the blogs I've done on it or review that webinar that we just did back in April. All right, so let's get out of slides and go look at an instance of ServiceNow. Let me go ahead and share. Hopefully you can see my browser. I am logged in as a system administrator. And I'm going to start as an administrator just to kind of highlight some of the things that we've already discussed. So there's a number of different property screens that are available to you that control the way change management behaves, including properties that are specific to conflict detection and standard change. I mentioned risk conditions as a key piece of the risk calculation capability and sharing a best practice. I'm a big fan of risk calculation and risk conditions in the sense that they're looking at data that exists within our system, and that data is objective in nature. Risk assessments, we touched on that really quickly. Assessments are defined, the conditions in which those assessments are triggered is able to be configured, and then you're able to define thresholds for those assessments to kind of determine how a change's risk will be determined. And then we talked about schedules and the key role that schedules play within conflict detection. I encourage you to identify those schedules where change is allowed or change is restricted, document them so that you're empowering your users with information that enables the organization to maximize their risk profile. So switching over to a user who only possesses the ITIL role, I'll have access to less information, not only within the entire platform, but within the change management application itself. If we kind of step through the creation of a change really quickly, looking at where we're at on time, let's just go ahead and create a normal change. And again, we see this form very comprehensive in nature. I'm going to pick a particular category. We'll select a configuration item, a relative priority for this work, a group who would fulfill my particular change. Here we can provide a short description, a more detailed description, and again, our justification for this change, our plan to implement it, our plan to test it, and heaven forbid something goes sideways, our plan to back that change out. On the scheduling tab, we can schedule this change or request a window of time for this change to be authorized. Let's just assume we want to do this thing tomorrow and we're going to need 2 hours to actually do it. I can save that change and note, based on the configure of conflict detection, we've already identified some conflicts that are available within this conflicts form section. And in the case of this particular CI, it is not scheduled for maintenance at the point in time that I defined within the plan start and end dates. A quick sidebar, if I wanted this change that I'm proposing to be performed against more than just one configuration item, there's nothing wrong with that. change management supports and allows that, and any additional configuration item would be associated with this change via the affected CI's related list. So if I'm applying a security patch to every Oracle database that's running a particular version, I can track all of that work in an individual change request, associate all those CIs under the affected CIs related list, and ServiceNow is automatically going to build a relationship between this change request and those CIs so that you always have that audit trail to go back to. I can manually execute risk calculation. If I so choose, on this instance, I've enabled risk assessment. My apology. Here's my risk assessment. Let's just assume that I feel that this is a reasonably low risk change. I can populate that risk assessment, execute risk calculation, and that risk assessment based on my responses will set my risk and impact levels. If I feel my change is ready for review, I've got the ability to request approval. And again, since this is a normal change, we're going to step through this entire state model that is represented within this formatter at the top of the form. So if I request approval, approval records will be generated to all members of this particular assignment group. If we perform an approval, and in this case I've configured this so I can approve my own work, maybe not the best practice for you in your environment, it then goes to an authorized level where an additional set of approvals will be available. If we switch users here really quickly and I go look at my approvals, Kristen Mitchell was one of the approvers for our change. I believe that was change 37. I can approve that change. Where's my number? Oh, I had my change number wrong. Let's just impersonate the admin here. Oh, it did have a 3 and a 7. I can approve that change. And then it allows me to proceed. And once I've approved it, we'll tell you that the planned start and end date is the authorized change window. Again, kind of forcing a rigid process. We can now move from the scheduled state to the implement state. When we do so, we'll automatically populate the actual start date of this change for you. Once we've implemented our change, tested our change, validated that we've completed work here, we can move this forward to the review state. Again, we automatically populate your end date so you have that full audit trail. Here is the window of time in which this change was authorized. Here is the window of time in which work was performed. And once we are happy that work has performed as expected, we can go ahead and close out that change. Now, at any point in time, if it makes sense, we can cancel a change. One thing that I didn't do earlier, perhaps I should have, we can refresh the impacted services that would have been impacted by this particular change. And refreshing impact services would walk the dependency tree that's been defined within your CMDB and identify services that this particular CI supports. So in the case of our CI, PS Aura 1, it is responsible for supporting all of these various business services. And if I come back to our change and refresh impacted services, we can see that we automatically populate this list, related list for you with the services that will be impacted by this change. We also have the ability to view other information about the CI as part of our assessment of risk. We can go straight to the CMDB and look at its CI health information, which is a capability that the CMDB team delivered a few releases ago. We've also got the ability to go look at the CI record for this particular change, and again, view its relationship information, understand who's responsible for supporting this, who it's managed by, any of the various details associated with the CI. And if we get to a point that we are ready to close out, we can just go ahead and close that change. And we will require that you fill in some mandatory information. How did the change go? Was it successful? Unsuccessful? Were there issues encountered along the way? And some notes that go along with that close code so that we can always come back and understand how successful we were and perhaps any issues that we encountered. Let's see. How are we on time, Rohan?
Yeah, we are doing fine. That was a great demo, Jason. Thank you so much. But can I ask for, like, based on your expertise and experience, any best practices or quick tips that you can share with us?
Sure. So I think the first, and let's cycle back to the slides. You know, the first thing I'm going to talk about is not overcomplicating change management. The processes that we offer out of the box are really sound. We've done a lot of work to incorporate process within change management, and that process is good. One of the most common questions I get from existing customers, especially those customers that have been around for a number of years, is how do I revert all of this customization that I've done over the years to get back to these processes that you offer out of the box, because these processes that you offer are sound. And the short answer for them, unfortunately, is there's no easy way back. So for you new customers, I would encourage you to configure as needed, but don't stray considerably out of the box or away from what we offer out of the box, because what we offer out of the box is really sound. In the Helsinki release, we released something called ITSM Guided Setup, which enabled us to kind of step you through a process of configuring IT service management applications. And in the Jakarta release, we've done a ton of work specifically in the area of incident and change management, incorporating process into the configuration of the application. So for customers that are new, that are embarking on a change management implementation, I will strongly encourage you to take a look at ITSM Guided Setup, specifically the change management application, because the product manager that has delivered that work has really done a great job, and that was work that me and my team consulted with her on throughout that release. Change management is certainly dependent on a sound CMDB, and really, good change management benefits from a robust CMDB that not only includes, your business service and your configuration items, but the way those configuration items relate to one another in support of that service. So while I would encourage people to invest in their configuration management process for change management, I would say that generically, incident management, problem management, change management, all benefit considerably from a robust CMDB, and I would argue you really can't offer transformational service without that foundation that the CMDB provides. And then finally, take advantage of the features that we offer out of the box, like conflict detection and risk calculation. Define schedules in which you allow normal changes to occur. Define those blackout periods where you don't want changes to occur, whether that's a regular schedule that exists throughout the week, or you have some sort of special event. Ensure that blackouts are defined so that your change management team and your fulfillment teams have all of the information available to them to optimize that risk profile for your organization. So I think that'd be my top 4 or 5 there, Ron.
Great. That's really valuable. Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. So I think now we can open the floor for questions. And while, Jason, you review those questions, there are already about 20 questions in the Q&A panel. I will walk everyone through a couple of slides which will talk about resources. And right after that, we can take those questions. So in resources, definitely the first place you would see a lot of information about change management, how you can set up, and what are the best practices around it. You will find all that information in the product documentation. And once I share the slide deck with you on the community, all these hyperlinks are working. So you can just click on those and check out the information. There is actually a process guide knowledge article created in the if you log into Hi and search for ITSM process guides, you will see a good guidance on how you should be implementing all your applications in ITSM, service catalog, change management, incident management, everything. I encourage you to look at the latest patches because a lot of times you might face an issue, but we might have already we might have already worked on that, and it could have been resolved in the latest patch. So it is really helpful if you look at the latest patch notes on those patches. And known error portal, even if we have not fixed a problem, we might have a workaround for you, and so it's another place you can look at before going deeper into the issues which you have. Apart from these, the community is a very good resource. Jason, if you can move to the next slide. That's where Jason was mentioning that he published some blogs, and you can look at that valuable information, those blogs. Again, these links will take you to those blogs directly. The discussions I've seen a lot of times when you post a question on community, it is much faster. It has a much faster response time. And there is a dedicated space called ITSM Guides in the community where we have tried to organize all the information and consolidate it in a better consumable way. We'll keep on improving it, so it's worth checking that. So now, Jason, we can pick, okay, yeah, these are some of the samples or examples of the blogs which Jason has published. Blackout and maintenance schedule in detail, change advisory board, the CAB workbench we were talking about. So these are a few examples of that.
Correct. All right, let's try to run through our list of questions as quickly as possible. Blaise said there was quite a bit of jitter on the phone call. I apologize for that, if that was on my end. Sebastian, question. Jakarta introduced a plugin with many enhancements. I'm not sure which plugin you are referring to, but you're suggesting you don't see any of the enhancements. I encourage you to work with the support organization on that. Presentation will be available. It will be posted on the community, and Rohan, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to just attach it to the post that announce this webinar, correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Sebastian, you will be able to get a copy of the presentation there. Concise inference. How do you handle changes that were opened as new and scheduled and the planned date has elapsed? You know, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about that. That change can be copied and canceled, and that's not a poor process. And then, you know, you can kind of re-go through the approvals. You know, oftentimes the final approver for a particular change in an organization is someone who is identified as the owner of that change or the coordinator of that change. And we have customers who, in this circumstance where the authorized change window has passed, that coordinator would work with the approval team, reset expectations, and continue forward with that change. In the Kingston release, depending on what state you're at, if you were at that assessed state in the normal change, you'd be able to kind of revert that back to new, but not available today. Out of the box, we have 4 risk conditions. I don't have any available that you can download, but I'm quite confident you might be able to find some out on the share site, share.servicenow.com. Conflict detection, how does it affect the system's performance when you select to search conflicts on child and parent CIs? That's a great question. The impact shouldn't be significant, and one of the reasons why conflict detection is limited to only look 1 level up or 1 level down in the CI hierarchy is for that exact reason. If you had a change that was associated with 100 CIs on that affected CIs related list, and you were looking, you know, more than 1 level of relationship up and down, the impact would be great. So we've limited that to 1 level up, 1 level down, but it shouldn't be significant. Let's see. Out of the box, authorized to send everything to the CAB approval team. Why is that? It's a representative example that's easily modified on your end. In Kingston, that actually changes just slightly in the sense that a normal change of low risk would skip that approval state, but going to the CAB approval group doesn't necessarily imply or mean that every change should go to the CAB for approval. CAB should really be focused on changes which are of the greatest impact and greatest risk to the organization. We modified that to be sent to the approval groups of the impacted services. I don't see a question in there. Will this affect in any way the CAB Workbench functionality? Okay, now I understand. CAB Workbench does nothing to change the approval scheme that you've defined using that base platform approval capability. The only thing CAB Workbench does is expose approve and reject actions within those meeting portals to users who have current approval records. It changes nothing about your underlying approval process. Can you explain how high-risk changes are routed to the CAB? I'm going to relate that to the CAB Workbench. The CAB Workbench enables the CAB manager to define criteria which will automatically associate change requests to a particular meeting occurrence. And oftentimes that filter criteria is just going to be copied directly from an existing report. So, you know, how do changes get associated with a CAB? One way is based on that filter criteria the CAB manager's defined. We also have a flag on the record called CAB required that is a way for change management teams to flag a change for the CAB manager to include in a particular CAB meeting if it doesn't meet the normal criteria for that CAB meeting. Refresh impacted services doesn't run against the added affected CIs. That's actually true. It runs against the CI that's specified in the configuration item field. Routine security patching can be complicated, specifically associating CIs to a change record. Out of the box uses a primary CI instead of associating all servers targeted. So primary CI is probably a label that you guys have put on the configuration item field. When you guys are assessing a change, well, first of all, you've already heard this within my presentation. The way to associate a single change with more than one CI is via the affected CI's related list. And anyone who is assessing the scope of that change or authorizing that change should be trained and know that to understand the entire scope of that change, that they should be reviewing that affected CI's related list, because applying a change to one system versus 100 is probably going to be a completely different risk and impact profile. Do you have any out-of-the-box rules? Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just doing a time check. It's already 11 here, so we can spend one more minute to answer any questions if there are many. So, but in case if we do not answer all the questions, everyone you can ask them on the community, but we'll spend one more minute to answer.
Yeah, out-of-the-box rule for segregation of duties, my recommendation is going to be to download that process guide that defines the various roles associated with change management and the responsibilities of that role. Can changes be viewed and approved by the native mobile apps? I don't know that answer off the top of my head. You can certainly view the change request form on a mobile device and approve or reject that change request, but I don't know the answer in the native mobile app. What's the best way to automate the refresh of impacted services? By executing the UI action. Who do you expect to do the review and close? Great question. In the case of review, I expect that to be done by the team which implemented the change if the change was successful. If it was unsuccessful, I expect someone who's in that change owner or change coordinator role to kind of drive that post-implementation review process. And ultimately close out that change once that review process has been done. I consider creating a patch schedule as a CI and associated. Yeah, I would probably avoid. I'm going to skip that one. Any modification of a record will automatically send change back through the authorization process. Is this out-of-the-box behavior? No. The rejection of a change will send it back to a new, but not the editing of details within the record. Question related between change and release. I'll let Rohan answer that after. What are your recommendations for testing following change management? How do we ensure robust testing following implementation changes? I'm going to make this the last answer, but this is a great question. One, your test plan better be documented within the change request before it's ever sent for peer level approval. And if that test plan isn't thorough, whether it's documented in the test plan field or a series of change tasks of type testing, you can't assess or authorize a change for implementation unless you understand how the team's going to validate that. And if it doesn't appear that there's been great thought put into how is this change going to be authorized or validated, to me that would be a significant risk, and one as an approver that I would question, but the real short answer to that question is you need to hold your people accountable for doing what they say they're going to do. And if they say that they're going to run through this 10-step verification process and something goes wrong with the change, either during the implementation or in the days following, many incidents are generated as a result of the change actually not being successful. People need to be held accountable for that. And as a leader within your change management team or for a particular team, that would be an opportunity to train that person. And ultimately, if they keep introducing issues in your environment, I would question if those are the people I want implementing change for me.
Great.
All right,
So,
Rohan.
Yeah, we'll stop here, but we'll try to answer the other questions on community post. But thank you so much, Jason, for taking the time and sharing this valuable information. And all others, thank you so much for attending. Go ahead.
Yes, and thank you, everyone, for attending.